Chapter 1. The Lost Cry in the Darkness. The planet Andarax, a lifeless expanse of dust, jagged rocks, and the remnants of a long-dead civilization, existed on the edge of known space, isolated from the bustling worlds of intergalactic society. It had once been a thriving hub for the Andorians, a species of intellectuals and explorers, whose civilizations sprawled across vast star systems. But now, centuries of war and neglect had reduced the once vibrant world to little more than a barren wasteland, its atmosphere thin and toxic, its cities mere shadows of their former glory. The great monuments, once symbols of unity and progress, had long since crumbled, leaving only fractured memories of a time when Andarax had been revered as a beacon of hope and enlightenment. The sands blew relentlessly across the surface, carrying with them the echoes of a forgotten past, as if the planet itself had decided to erase all memory of its former inhabitants, its former life. Yet, amid this desolation, a voice pierced the silence. It wasn't the usual cry of an animal, nor was it the mechanical hum of an automated system struggling to function. It was the voice of a being fragile, desperate, and alone. For 13 days, that cry had been heard faint at first, a whisper carried by the wind, but growing louder with each passing hour, each passing day. It was the voice of Zara, an alien woman abandoned by those who had promised to protect her, left to die on a planet so remote and isolated that it seemed as though no one would ever find her. Her species, the Andorians, had once been powerful, their empire stretching across the stars, their technology advanced beyond anything humanity could fathom. But now, that empire was a ghost, its people scattered, broken, and forgotten. Zara had been one of the last of her kind, stranded on Andarax, with no means of communication, no way to call for help, and no one left to answer her cries. Zara had been cast aside, a casualty of war, a pawn in a political game far beyond her control. She had been told that help was on the way, that her people would rescue her, but as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the reality of her isolation became all too clear. Her once vibrant eyes, a shimmering shade of violet, had dulled from exhaustion and despair. Her skin, once radiant with the light of her homeworld's twin suns, had become pale and brittle, the color draining from it as the energy she had relied upon slowly faded. Her body, weakened by dehydration and the harsh environment, had become frail, her limbs shaking with every step. The days of walking across the rocky plains had left her feet raw, her bones aching with each movement. Her voice, once strong and commanding, had grown hoarse, its strength diminishing with every call for help, every desperate cry into the wind that seemed to carry her words further into the emptiness. Zara had once been part of a grand mission, a mission that promised to change the fate of her people. She had been sent to Andarax to study the remnants of an ancient civilization buried deep within the planet's core, a civilization that, according to her people, held the key to unlocking new technologies that could bring their empire back from the brink of collapse. But things had gone wrong. The mission had been sabotaged, and Zara found herself stranded, cut off from any form of assistance. The very ship that had brought her to the planet, the Oculis, had malfunctioned, its systems failing one by one until it became nothing more than a lifeless hulk, abandoned on the barren surface. The crew, once her allies, had turned their backs on her, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that was unforgiving, hostile, and indifferent. Zara's hope had withered, but the fire within her never died completely. Every day, she cried for help, her voice carried on the wind, but no one came. The winds on Andarax were relentless, their howling whispers a constant reminder of her isolation. The sounds of the wind seemed to mock her, as if the planet itself was aware of her desperation and sought to drown out her cries with the fury of the elements. But Zara, though battered and broken, refused to surrender. Each time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the planet into an eerie, cold darkness, she would sit and rest, staring at the stars above, praying that someone, anyone, would hear her. Her cries had become a mantra, a way to cling to the last remnants of hope that had not yet faded. She had been abandoned, yes, but she was not dead, and as long as she lived, she would never give up on the possibility of being found. And then, on the 13th day, something changed. At first, Zara thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the mind brought on by the exhaustion and dehydration that had begun to cloud her thoughts. The cry she heard, faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, was different from all the others. It wasn't just the wind howling through the cracked, barren landscape, and it wasn't the usual sounds of the environment. This was something else, something alive, something that had not been there before. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her chest as she strained to listen. The sound grew louder, and for a moment, Zara thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, a hum, a faint vibration in the air that she could feel deep in her bones. A ship, a human ship. Zara's eyes widened with disbelief, and she stumbled to her feet, her body weak from the strain of the past several days. But the sight of something, anything, was enough to propel her forward. She knew it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. She had to believe it. She was going to be saved. Her cries had not gone unheard. With every step, her hope reignited, a spark in her chest that burned brighter than any star. She stumbled toward the source of the sound, her legs trembling with the effort, her body protesting every movement. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the jagged rocks sharp and unforgiving, but she couldn't stop. The sound grew louder, and soon, she could see it, small at first, just a dot in the distance. But as she neared, it grew larger, clearer. The ship was real, and it was coming for her. For the first time in 13 days, Zara's breath came easily, and her heart beat steadily in her chest. She had survived the isolation, the pain, the darkness of a world that had forgotten her, and now, someone had heard her. The human ship, though small and unassuming compared to the grandeur of her people's vessels, represented everything Zara had longed for: hope, salvation, and a chance to escape the cruel fate that had been forced upon her. With the last of her strength, Zara cried out once more, her voice raw but filled with the same desperation she had felt when she first arrived on Andarax. But now, there was something else in her voice, something deeper, something stronger. This time, she knew her cries would not go unanswered. The human ship was nearing, and she would be rescued. Zara's body trembled with exhaustion as she pushed forward, her steps growing weaker with each stride. The weight of 13 days of desperation had taken its toll on her, but the sight of the ship, a human ship, offered her a new surge of strength. Her violet eyes, once dull with despair, began to glisten again, catching the light of the distant sun that hung lazily on the horizon. The familiar warmth of the sun, though faint, felt like a beacon of hope. She could hear the ship's engines now, a low hum vibrating through the atmosphere, a sound that resonated in her very bones. It was not a sound she had ever associated with the beings from her own species. No, this was different. These were humans, the same species that had explored the galaxy's edges, the ones she had read about in old texts from the Dominion, the ones who had yet to fully understand the galaxy's intricacies, but were ever curious and relentless. But Zara had little knowledge of them beyond the old stories, stories that spoke of a distant, young species, full of ambition but with little understanding of the deeper, older powers that governed the universe. Her fingers gripped the dusty earth as she collapsed on the jagged rocks that littered the surface of Andarax. The strain on her body had been too much, but the ship was so close now. She could almost taste the relief, like water in the desert, though she knew the journey was not yet over. Her mind raced with questions. Why had the humans come to this remote world? How had they even found her here? Her species had never truly interacted with humanity, and the Dominion's data on them had been sparse, mostly ignored due to the isolation of her people. But now, they were here, and they were coming closer. Zara's breath was shallow and uneven, but she forced herself to rise to her feet again, determined not to let this opportunity slip away. The distant sound of the ship grew louder, echoing across the emptiness of the planet's surface. Zara reached out with her mind, the faint whispers of her race's ancient telepathic abilities brushing the edges of her consciousness. But they were weak now, like a flickering flame in the wind. She could no longer connect with her people, no longer reach out to the minds of the distant stars. It was just her now, alone, with nothing but her own will and the ship on the horizon to guide her. And then, as if to confirm her every thought, the ship appeared above the skyline, breaking through the dust and clouds in the distance. It was small, a silhouette against the brightening sky, but to Zara, it was the largest thing she had seen in days. Its sleek, metallic surface gleamed as it descended toward the surface of Andarax, casting a long shadow across the crumbled ruins that lay at the edge of the barren fields. The ship hovered for a moment before landing gently on the rocky ground, sending up plumes of dust in every direction. Its landing gears extended with a soft hiss, and for the first time in days, Zara felt a hope unlike anything she had ever known. The ship's presence signaled the end of her solitude, the end of her suffering. With trembling hands, Zara straightened herself and took her first step toward the ship, her legs wobbling from the strain. She was determined, though. She would not collapse now, not when salvation was within her reach. As she staggered closer, her mind raced with anticipation. Would they help her? Would they understand her, even though she was so different? There was a churning uncertainty in her chest, but it was outweighed by the urgency of the situation. She needed them, and they were here. It didn't matter who they were or where they came from. What mattered now was that they had answered her call. The ship's hatch opened with a hiss, revealing a human figure. He stepped out, tall and lean, wearing a uniform that spoke of military or exploratory duty. His features were sharp, his eyes scanning the landscape, taking in the desolate surroundings with a mix of curiosity and caution. He didn't seem to be expecting her. He was looking around, perhaps assessing the area, uncertain of what had brought him here. But Zara, for all her exhaustion and fear, knew that this was her chance. She cried out one last time, her voice hoarse, but unmistakable. "Help me, please." The man froze, his gaze snapping to her. His eyes widened, and then, for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. There was an unmistakable recognition in his eyes, but it was more than surprise. It was something else, something deeper. He knew what he was seeing. He understood the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, he moved toward her, his steps quick and purposeful. Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent, the words strange coming from a human tongue. Zara could hear the concern in his tone, and for a moment, it almost made her break down. She had been alone for so long, isolated from everything and everyone she had ever known. But now, this stranger was here, offering her a lifeline. Zara's knees buckled as her body gave way, the fatigue finally overcoming her. She collapsed into his arms, unable to hold herself upright any longer. She gasped for breath, her chest heaving with the effort. I've been alone for so long," she whispered, the words barely escaping her cracked lips. The man gently helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed. "I'm Captain Elias Ward," he said, his voice calm but firm, though his face showed signs of concern. "You're safe now. We'll get you out of here." Zara tried to focus on his words, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. She had never imagined a human could be so kind, especially after everything she had been through. She had prepared herself to die alone on this forsaken planet, to fade into the dust like the civilizations before her. But now, there was hope. "I'm Zara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Zara of the Andorians." Captain Ward's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to place the name. "Andorians? I've never heard of your people. You are not from here." Zara shook her head, her long hair falling over her shoulders in tangled waves. "No, my people are gone. I was abandoned here, on this world. I've been alone for too long." Captain Ward looked at her for a moment, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "How did you end up here? What happened?" Zara took a shaky breath, the story of her fall from grace welling up within her chest. She had so much to explain, so much to share, but the words didn't come easily. There was too much pain, too many years of suffering, to condense into simple sentences. Instead, she simply gestured toward the ship, the wreckage of her past, the broken promise of her people. I was sent here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "To study, to learn. But something went wrong. I was abandoned, left to die." Captain Ward's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. "I don't know much about your people, Zara, but I know that this isn't right. You shouldn't have been left alone like this. We'll figure this out. Together." Zara looked up at him, hope blossoming in her chest for the first time in days. He had heard her. He had answered her cry. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone anymore. Chapter 2. The First Step Toward Salvation. The journey back to the human ship, the Cassandra, was slow but steady. Captain Ward had guided Zara with a gentle hand, offering her support when her strength faltered and making sure she didn't collapse under the weight of her exhaustion. She hadn't realized how much she had been relying on the hope that someone would come for her until it had finally arrived. His presence, his steady reassurance, seemed to revive her with each passing moment, though her body still felt fragile, as if it might break at any moment. The ship, though small and unremarkable by intergalactic standards, was a beacon of safety to Zara. She had been in the wreckage of her own mind for so long that now, seeing the warm interior of the human ship, hearing the hum of its engines, and feeling the air that wasn't thick with dust or dry heat, made her realize how much she had been starved for something as simple as comfort. The ship's interior was utilitarian but clean, with a faint smell of fresh air and metallic surfaces. The soft glow of lights overhead reflected off the walls, and the steady thrum of engines beneath her feet brought a sense of familiarity. Captain Ward helped her onto one of the seats, his hands steady and kind as he adjusted her into a comfortable position. "I'll get you something to eat and drink. You've been through a lot." Zara nodded weakly, grateful for his kindness. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated with care, to not be seen as a burden or a failure. The thought of her people, of the Andorians, flickered in her mind. Where had they gone? What had happened to the once great empire? But now was not the time to think of those things. Now, she had to focus on survival, on the immediate future. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the ship seep into her bones, as if it were the first true comfort she had known in years. She was no longer alone. The human who had come for her had given her the chance to start again, and though she wasn't sure where this new path would lead, it was a beginning. The ship lifted off, slowly rising into the sky, leaving the barren world of Andarax behind. Zara watched the desolate landscape shrink into the distance, and for the first time in 13 days, she let herself breathe. The galaxy was vast, and she had no idea what awaited her, but one thing was certain: she was no longer lost. Someone had heard her cry, and that, in itself, was a miracle. Zara sat quietly in the seat, the hum of the ship's engines and the soft flicker of lights in the cabin soothing her. Every part of her body still ached from the brutal days of survival on Andarax, but the warmth in the air and the constant motion of the ship made her feel as if she had crossed an invisible line between life and death. Captain Elias Ward had already gone to the cockpit to prepare for their departure, and Zara was left alone, drifting in her thoughts, struggling to piece together what had just happened. The ship's interior was modest, with a series of controls and monitors that flickered with blue and green lights. A few other humans crew members had glanced briefly in her direction as they passed by, but none had stopped to ask questions or offer condolences. There was a quiet professionalism to the way they operated, but Zara could feel the subtle curiosity in the air. She was an enigma, an alien woman from a long-forgotten species, a living relic of a shattered empire. She had been stranded on a dead world, left to die, and yet now, a human crew had rescued her, offering her a second chance at life that she thought had long since been extinguished. What would she do with this second chance? She had no answers yet, no plan, but there was an undeniable sense of relief that weighed less heavily on her chest. Captain Ward returned after a few minutes, holding a small tray with a simple meal rations that appeared both functional and nourishing, though not particularly appetizing. But to Zara, they were a feast. She had not eaten anything substantial in days, her body weak from hunger and dehydration. She took the meal gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she raised it to her lips. She savored each bite slowly, not wanting to waste a single morsel. The food, though bland, brought with it a sense of normalcy, something she had desperately longed for since the moment she had been abandoned on Andarax. "I know it's not much," Elias said as he sat down across from her, his eyes flickering with something akin to empathy. "We've got limited supplies on this ship, but it should help you regain some strength." Zara nodded, unable to speak at first as she finished the last bite of food. Her throat burned with the effort, but she forced the words out. "Thank you. For everything." Captain Ward's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. It's what anyone would have done if they'd heard your cries." Zara could feel a warmth flood through her chest, not from the food, but from the kindness in his voice. She had not expected this from a human. From everything she had been taught, humanity was still a relatively young species untested, their methods of exploration primitive compared to the Dominion. But now, in front of her, she saw the truth of it. Humans were resourceful, brave, and capable of compassion when they chose to be. The silence between them stretched for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in weeks, Zara felt a sense of calm. The ship's hum became a gentle backdrop, lulling her into a state of peace she had forgotten. But then her thoughts drifted, and she couldn't keep herself from asking the question that had been gnawing at her since she had first seen the human ship. "You are from Earth, right?" Zara asked, looking at him curiously. The name, Earth, was a faint echo in her mind, one of many fragments of knowledge from her own studies of the stars and their inhabitants. "I've read about your world, but it's far from here. Why would you come out this far?" Elias leaned back in his seat, considering her question for a moment. "That's a bit of a long story. I'm part of a salvage crew, tasked with exploring the outer rim for any usable technology or resources. We've been making our way through this sector for a while, but we weren't expecting to find, well, you." He let out a soft laugh, the sound tinged with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "But as for why we're here, the truth is that the outer rim is a pretty dangerous place. We're just trying to get by, make a living." Zara frowned slightly, still piecing together the details. "A salvage crew? And you just happened to hear me?" Her voice faltered for a moment as the weight of everything she had experienced in the last few days settled back onto her shoulders. "I had no one left. No one to hear my cry." Elias's expression grew somber. "I can't imagine what you've been through. But I'm glad we found you. It might not make much sense right now, but your story, it's important. And I want to help you." Zara looked down at her hands, fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that had crept in. She wasn't used to depending on anyone, least of all a human, but there was something in his words, something sincere. She could feel his desire to help, to make things right, and it stirred something deep inside her. "I don't know where to go from here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do, or how to rebuild. My people, they're gone. The Dominion is dead. My mission was supposed to help us rise again, but now there's nothing left." Elias's gaze softened as he met her eyes. "You're not alone anymore. There's more out there, people who can help. Maybe it's not too late to rebuild, to find something worth fighting for. If you want, I'll help you. Whatever it takes." Zara's heart swelled, an unfamiliar warmth flooding her chest. She had never expected to find this kind of solidarity, this kind of hope, among the stars. "But how?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly as the weight of her past seemed to catch up with her. "How can we rebuild? I don't even know where to start." Elias leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "We start by learning what we can. We start by finding the pieces of the puzzle and putting them back together. There's always a way forward, Zara. Always." The sincerity in his words, the belief he carried, was something Zara hadn't encountered in years. The galaxy, once so vast and unknown, now seemed a little less daunting with this human by her side. She wasn't sure how, or why, she had been given a second chance, but it was clear to her now that she had a path to follow. A new chapter was beginning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. Chapter 3, The Path Forward. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The Cassandra, the small human salvage ship that had saved Zara, was more than just a vessel to her now. It had become a sanctuary, a place of refuge in the vast, cold expanse of space. Zara had never imagined that she would find herself on such a ship, traveling through unknown territories with a crew of humans who had only just learned of her existence. But as the days passed, she found herself becoming accustomed to their presence, their way of life. The crew of the Cassandra were not unlike Elias, curious, compassionate, and above all, resilient. They had their own reasons for being out here in the unknown reaches of space, seeking resources to keep their lives afloat, but they were not indifferent to the plight of others. Zara could see that in the way they treated her, with care and respect, though she was an alien to them. Their willingness to help her rebuild was an act of kindness that she had never anticipated, especially given the cold nature of the universe she had once known. It wasn't long before Elias began to share more with Zara about humanity and their place in the galaxy. He explained the human efforts to explore the Outer Rim, the way they had carved out a living in this dangerous frontier. There were others, Elias told her, other colonies, other humans scattered across distant worlds. They weren't an advanced empire like the Dominion had been, but they were survivors. They had endured hardship and war, but they hadn't been broken. Zara listened intently, absorbing every detail. The more she learned, the more she realized that perhaps, after all these years of searching for answers and knowledge, the key to survival wasn't in grand empires or powerful technologies, it was in people. People who, no matter how far they had fallen, could still find hope. And perhaps, that was where her journey truly began. Together, they set their course for the nearest human colony, a small world called Atheris, where Elias believed they could find some answers to Zara's questions. As the Cassandra accelerated into hyperspace, Zara felt the pull of the unknown, the pull of a new chapter in her life. She was no longer the abandoned survivor of a lost empire. She was someone who had been given a chance to rebuild, to make a difference, and to connect with others who understood that survival was never just about technology or resources, it was about the strength of the bonds between people. And for the first time in a long while, Zara felt a glimmer of something she had long lost: hope. As the Cassandra drifted deeper into hyperspace, the hum of its engines resonated through the walls of the ship, a comforting and rhythmic sound that seemed to soothe Zara's nerves. It had been many days since the ship's crew had rescued her, and though the reality of her situation was still sinking in, she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The crew had treated her with kindness, answering her questions about humanity's struggle for survival in the far reaches of the galaxy, and slowly, Zara's perception of the human race began to shift. They were not the primitive, untested species she had once assumed them to be. Their resilience in the face of adversity, their ability to keep fighting despite the odds stacked against them, made her realize that perhaps there was more to them than she had first understood. Elias had become something of a guide for Zara, his calm presence offering her both reassurance and answers, but the rest of the crew, too, were proving to be valuable in her recovery. There was Lily, the ship's navigator, a brilliant strategist who had an unshakable determination to always stay 2 steps ahead. And then there was Milo, the engineer, a quiet man with an infectious enthusiasm for technology. They were a diverse crew, with different backgrounds and motivations, but what stood out to Zara was their unity. They operated as a team, each supporting the other, their bonds forged in the harshest conditions of space. It wasn't just their skills that kept them alive, it was their shared sense of purpose, the mutual trust they had built over time. Zara couldn't help but wonder if that was what had been missing in her own life purpose. She had been so consumed by the loss of her people, by the destruction of her empire, that she had forgotten what it meant to live for something greater than herself. The Cassandra's crew had shown her that survival wasn't just about keeping your own head above water. It was about coming together, finding strength in one another. As the days passed and the ship neared Atheris, Zara began to regain her strength. Her once dull skin now shimmered with renewed vitality, and though her memories of the past still haunted her, she was slowly learning to let go of the weight that had kept her tethered to despair. The first fragment of her journey had been to survive, to find safety. But now, she knew, the real challenge lay ahead. Her mission was not just about finding the remains of her people, it was about finding a way to rebuild, to reconnect with those who could still help her carry the legacy of the Dominion. She stood on the observation deck one evening, staring out at the stars as the ship sliced through the darkness of space. Atheris was just ahead, a small world orbiting a quiet star. She could barely make out the planet's outline against the endless backdrop of space, but there was something about it, something in the way the distant light caught its surface that filled her with an emotion she hadn't felt in years: hope. Thinking about home, Elias' voice interrupted her thoughts. He had appeared behind her, standing quietly, giving her space to breathe. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on his presence until now. Home, Zara repeated, a small, bittersweet smile playing at the corner of her lips. I don't know if I can call anywhere home anymore. Elias nodded, understanding. Atheris won't be home for you, Zara. Not yet. But it might be the beginning of something new. You've got a lot to offer, and you'll find a place here. With us. We'll figure it out together. Zara looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing his words. She had been alone for so long, struggling to make sense of her world, her past, and the weight of the Dominion's fall. Yet Elias' words struck a chord in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wasn't facing it alone anymore. I hope you're right, she said quietly, her voice steady, though the uncertainty still lingered beneath her words. You've got a good team behind you, Elias replied, offering her a reassuring smile. And I don't think anyone who survived what you have would give up so easily. Chapter 4. The beginning of a new legacy. The planet Atheris came into view the next day, its surface dotted with lush forests, rivers that shimmered under the light of its twin suns, and cities that seemed to pulse with energy. The people of Atheris were not known for their advanced technology, but they were resourceful, living in harmony with their environment, focusing on the preservation of their world and the prosperity of their society. It was a stark contrast to the harsh, barren world of Andarax, and for Zara, it felt like the first step towards something she hadn't dared to hope for in a long time, a future. The Cassandra landed gently on the outskirts of one of Atheris' largest cities, its sleek hull coming to rest on the soft grass of the planet's fertile soil. The crew quickly disembarked, and Zara followed closely behind, her senses overwhelmed by the vibrant life around her. The air was fresh and clean, a sharp contrast to the toxic winds of Andarax. The sounds of birds, the rustling of trees in the wind, and the murmur of distant conversation filled the atmosphere, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Zara felt something akin to peace. Elias led the way, a few of the crew members following close behind. This is Atheris, he said with a smile. Not much to look at from space, but it's home to a lot of good people. We'll get you settled in, show you around, and figure out what's next. Zara looked around, taking in the sights, the bustling streets, the towering buildings made of natural materials that blended seamlessly with the landscape. It wasn't the grand cities of the Dominion, but there was something here, a sense of community, of people working together, sharing a common purpose. She felt a flicker of something stir within her, something she had not felt for years, belonging. She had been a part of an empire that fell, but perhaps she could still be part of something, no matter how small, that could rise again. The leader of Atheris, a tall and dignified woman named Lyra, greeted them warmly. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied Zara with curiosity, but also with an unspoken understanding. The two women exchanged a few words in private, and Zara found herself explaining her situation, the fall of the Dominion, the purpose of her mission, and the fragments of power scattered across the galaxy. I see, Lyra said after listening to Zara's story. We've had reports of unusual energy readings near your home system. We'll need to investigate further. But first, you need rest. You've been through far more than most can imagine. Zara nodded, her mind still racing with thoughts of her people, her mission, and the future that awaited her. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel as suffocating. She had a place here, and there were people who understood. There was hope for something greater, something beyond survival. As she stood among the people of Atheris, Zara felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She had been abandoned on a dead world, left to die alone in the vastness of space. But now, here she was, standing on a new world, with new possibilities stretching before her. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had found a new family, a new cause, and together, they would rebuild what had been lost. The legacy of the Dominion was far from over. It was only just beginning.